OEIS sequence A000045. The Fibonacci numbers 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55.
Today's guest is Neil Sloane. Neil's had a long and distinguished career in mathematics, the majority at the famed Bell Labs. But the thing he's probably best known for is a collection of numbers that started as a side project but turned into the Online Encyclopedia of Integer Sequences, the OEIS. This incredible resource is so closely associated with Neil that many people refer to it simply as Sloane's. Now here on Numberphile we've made plenty of videos over the years that refer to Sloane's menagerie of sequences, but in more recent times we've been lucky enough to have Neil himself as a regular guest on the channel. Between filming sessions we recorded this podcast among the countless papers, scrolls and numbery treasures filed away in his New Jersey attic. So Neil, we're in your house. And at the moment we're in, what do you call this room? Is this like your study or
Yeah, it's my study.
But you seem to have multiple studies though.
Well, this is the main one. Now, I've only got one. I used to have an office
Right.
at Bell Labs, which had a lot of stuff in it, and all that stuff is now here.
There's so much stuff here. There's books and folders and binders, and it feels kind of chaotic, but anytime you seem to want to get your hands on something, you seem to get it straight away. So there's obviously some method to the madness.
There's a pattern, yes. And there are indexes to things.
There are labels written all over everything. So would you describe yourself as like a super organized person then, or like...
No, quite the opposite. That's why there are all the labels. No, I'm very disorganized.
Okay.
But I have indexes to things.
And
Yeah.
But you find it easy to work in sort of this, would you call it cluttered, or is that the right word, or like very full environment?
I don't regard this as cluttered.
No?
You should have seen my office at Bell Labs.
Is it worse?
Oh, much worse.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, before we get to Bell Labs, because that's obviously something I want to ask you about, let's find out where it all started for you. And that, first of all, where were you born and where were you a boy?
I was born in Wales in 1939, just after the war began.
Whereabouts in Wales?
Beaumaris, Anglesey.
Anglesey.
And then after the war, we moved to England. My father got a job at Saunders Row in the Isle of Wight. We lived in Cowes for a year or two. Things were really bad, as you know, in England after the war. The weather was terrible. There was food rationing. There was coal rationing. Everything was rationed. There was almost no food, no fruit. It was very hard to live there. And there were all these advertisements, come to sunny Australia.
During this post-war period, or even maybe even the end of the war, are these strong memories for you? Do you remember it well, or is it all lost in the mists of time as a boy?
It made a very strong impression at the time, so it's not lost. I remember things being pretty bad, very cold, hungry, not much food, very unpleasant living conditions. And I remember the drilling. One of my strongest memories in living in Cowes was from early in the morning till late at night, all you would hear was the drilling of the dismantling the air raid shelters in the streets.
Like jackhammers?
Jackhammers, yes, exactly.
So smashing them all?
Dismantling them.
Okay.
Yes, all continually. That's one of my strongest memories.
So what was your education like at this point, like your early education? Was it still a normal school education?
Yeah. Isle of Wight County School, I think it was. I still have one of the prize books from, I think, 1948.
Were you pretty numbery? Was the writing on the wall for your career at that point?
I don't think so, no.
And then tell me how you find your way to Australia.
Oh, my parents, my father in particular, who really hated the cold. And it was freezing cold. The houses were not heated. It was very unpleasant. So he persuaded my mother... you could get an assisted passage to Australia if you had a relative there who would sponsor you for £10.
£10 pom.
Each, yes. Yeah. And so we took the ship, the Chitral, which broke down in the middle of the Indian Ocean. We were very low on water. The propeller shaft broke in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So we were stranded there for a week or so.
Were lives in danger, or did they get...
No, but with the water, I remember the water in the water bottles was turning green. So eventually we got to Fremantle.
Yeah. This is in Western
Perth,
Australia.
yeah. I don't think we stopped in Adelaide. I think we went straight to Melbourne.
Ah, you missed the best bit.
Yeah, right. Yes. Yeah.
And then Melbourne became home.
Well, that's where we got off the ship, and our relatives who lived on a farm in Gippsland, in Coligny, they came and picked us up, and we lived on the farm, a dairy farm, for a year, and then moved to Traralgon.
Traralgon? My best friend who I do another podcast with is from Traralgon.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I remember the town. Wonderful. Wide streets, big ditches for the rains.
Were you a happy boy? Was it a happy childhood?
Not especially. No, I don't think so.
No?
Does anyone have a happy childhood? No. Not in my experience.
Right.
And then we moved to the Dandenongs, Mount Evelyn.
Yeah.
And my father commuted into the centre of Melbourne. And then we moved to Melbourne.
At this point, like, were you considering yourself to be an Australian, or did you consider yourself to be an English lad who'd moved to Australia? How were you identifying yourself at this point?
I didn't really think about it.
And what was your relationship with school and academia at this point? Were you starting to develop into who you are now, or?
I guess, yeah. Especially at the high school I went to in Melbourne. Maudie Alec Callum High School, it was.
Right.
Maybe still is, yeah.
Did you like numbers?
Yeah, I like numbers. I liked everything. It was fun. And then I got a scholarship to one of the better schools there. And so I spent, 52, 53, 54, 4 years at Scotch College.
Okay.
And then went to the university in Melbourne.
You went to university in Melbourne as well?
Yeah.
Does that mean you were in Melbourne for the Melbourne Olympics?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah?
Yeah, I got to see India play Pakistan at hockey.
You went and saw the real Olympics?
Yes, because many of the games were played on the university grounds.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, and I was a freshman in 1956 at the university there. And at that time, there was only one university, just the University of Melbourne.
What were you studying at university?
Mathematics, I guess, arts. I got a BA, Hons. But I also did a BEE simultaneously. I did a Bachelor of Electrical Engineering. So I got 2 degrees in 5 years as an undergraduate there.
So if I'd gone back in time to like the end of high school and the start of university, and I'd said to Neil, what do you want to do? Like, what job do you want? What career are you hoping to get? How would you have answered me?
I don't think I would have known what to say at that time. But when I was in my final year in electrical engineering, I wrote to various universities in the US. I wrote to Harvard, applying for any kind of opening, assistant fellowship in engineering. Harvard wrote back and said, sorry, we don't have an engineering department.
Right.
So I wrote to Cornell. Cornell wrote back and said, yeah, we'll offer you something or other fellowship. So I said, okay. And that was that.
I don't know if you've got a poor memory or you don't like talking about it, but you don't sound like you're this sort of over-enthusiastic, overachieving, ambitious youngster, and yet you're writing to US universities.
Well, that was the one thing I did.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And Cornell took you?
Cornell took me right away.
Right.
Nick DeClaris. I was quite interested in circuit theory. In my 4th year in the Bachelor of Engineering, I got very interested in circuit analysis and circuit synthesis.
Right.
And since that is really very mathematical, they asked me to give some lectures about it. So this was something I really got very interested in. That was really my main love.
So how did you get from Australia to the US? Were you still ships at this point, or were you flying now?
I flew. Stopped in Fiji.
Like, are you doing a doctorate there?
I was admitted to the master's program.
Right.
So they made me do a master's degree first. So I got an MS there. And then I went on and got a PhD. And then I stayed on to teach. I was an assistant professor for 2 years there.
How was the culture change coming from Australia to the US?
It was very cold. Cornell was very cold. I didn't even have an overcoat when I arrived.
Right.
But they gave me a roommate, a US student who was a first-year civil engineering student,
Yeah.
and he gave me a spare overcoat.
Did you give it back?
No.
Are you still friends with him? Do you know who he is?
I have not been in touch with him since, 1962 or 3.
But I hope he doesn't hear this. He might want that coat back.
Don't think so. I think he was happy. It wasn't a very thick coat. And the winds were very cold in Ithaca, blowing down the gorges. Much colder than anything in Australia.
I can imagine. So you're assistant professor at Cornell. In what department?
Electrical engineering. Yeah.
Okay. And then what happens?
After I was working in circuit theory to do my PhD, I switched over to working on what are now called neural networks.
Right.
In those days, they were called perceptrons.
Okay.
I was supervised by a scientist called Frank Rosenblatt, who wrote a book about these perceptrons. And the book is actually sitting right there.
Oh, here we go. It's now in my hand. Principles of Neurodynamics.
It's what are called neural networks now. So you have layers and layers of cells, neurons, that fire or don't fire, and they have a threshold, and you adjust the thresholds, and the neurons are all connected, and you try to train this network to, for instance, recognize letters, or recognize speech, or do things.
Okay.
Nowadays, you might call it artificial intelligence. And there are a lot of interesting mathematical questions. And that's what I got involved with.
Are you still at Cornell at this point, or?
Yes. Yeah, this is still Cornell.
Okay.
I stayed at Cornell from 61 until 67.
Right.
Till the riots.
What riots?
The race riots. The student rebellions.
This was at Cornell?
Cornell. I still have in one of these notebooks here pictures from the newspapers of the time with headlines like, "The guns come to Cornell." And there's a picture of some guys with rifles and ammunition slings in front of the student union. There were rebellions all over the US at that time.
What was that like? Was that really scary?
It was very interesting to be on the faculty at that time. Because I got to go to the faculty meetings.
Hear all the behind the scenes of what they're saying and doing. And
hear the discussions. So the whole faculty, however many there were, 5,000, 15,000 faculty would be in the arsenal, the military building, the biggest building on campus.
And what were they saying?
Discussing how to react to the students' demands. Should we resist or shall we capitulate?
Were you part of that discussion or were you too junior?
I was too junior to raise my hand even.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was some big, powerful, many famous people.
OEIS sequence A068679. Numbers which yield a prime whenever a 1 is inserted anywhere in them, including at the beginning or end. 1, 3, 7, 13, 31, 49, 63, 81, 91, 99, 103, 109.
So what next? Where did you go from there?
So after I got my PhD, I got involved in error correcting codes, which again is very mathematical.
Yeah.
Extremely mathematical. So that appealed to me a lot. It's very algebraic.
Was there a lot of call for error correcting codes at this point because the technology was evolving in that direction? Or?
Yes, yeah. And it was a subject that the electrical engineering department was very interested in.
Yeah.
So they asked me to give a course, and I used the manuscript notes from a person at Bell Labs, Elwyn Berlekamp, who would come to Cornell from time to time. Many of the, I can't call them faculty, but many of the Bell Labs math department members would travel around to universities to give talks and recruit people.
At this point, Bell Labs, I imagine, is this mythical place full of all these incredible people who are like gods coming from above to come and talk to you. And
yes, essentially, yes.
Yeah. Right. And Elwyn was one of these people, and you started having something to do.
I interacted with him. I sent him, he offered $1 for every error in the manuscript, his coding, so I sent him a lot. And I went and worked there for a summer of 67, I think.
Yeah.
And we did some good stuff together.
Yeah. So
during the next year, I told him when he visited Cornell that I was wondering what to do. And he said, well, you could come and work at Bell Labs.
This is the dream, isn't it?
Yeah.
But did Elwyn have that power, or did he then have to recommend you to someone? Or
Yes, there were, but that was enough.
How did that feel when you got told, okay, you can come and work at Bell Labs?
Pretty nice.
Yeah.
Like going to heaven.
Yeah. What was that time like at Bell Labs? Like, well, you were there for a long time after that, weren't you?
Yes, many years, 40 or more years.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was great. Wonderful. Yes.
I mean, you can't sum up 40 years, can you, in just a few sentences? But just give me some idea of what it was like to be one of the Bell Labs people at this time. Like, this dream time, isn't it? Like all this amazing stuff happening around you.
There were a lot of very good people.
Yeah.
Very smart people. Yes, not just in the mathematics and statistics department, but you went up 3 or 4 flights and there were all the computing experts. The Unix room, Ken Thompson, up on the 6th floor.
Is it a place where everyone's working together, or are you all kind of beavering away in your own little cubby holes?
Both.
When does the collaboration happen? Like at coffee breaks, or do you go and seek out the people you need in their different departments? Or?
Yes, and occasionally people would come around from other departments, and we always had the tradition of open doors. So someone would stick their head in the door and say, here's a nice problem. Do you know anyone who might be interested? And you say, well, you could try so-and-so down the hall.
Okay.
And it's very nice when you're asked to solve a problem that's come up in someone else's department related to, the telephone business.
You're mainly doing error correcting still at this point? That's still your thing?
I was involved in several other projects too, but certainly error correction. I was writing a book with Jessie McWilliams. She had already started it, or had the idea for it, but it changed a bit as we worked on it. And it grew also in size considerably.
So the arc of your time at Bell Labs, what would I say you were doing? What was your main, or did it change every few years?
It would change all the time. The tradition there was very nice. Everybody was called an MTS, a member of technical staff.
Yeah.
From the president all the way down, everyone there, well, everyone except for the staff, but all the PhDs there, and there were a lot of them, they were just called members of technical staff. And the idea was you would work on anything.
By the time you finished there, what were you doing? What did your area of expertise become by then?
I was still involved in many different projects. There was the work on Gossett, on the computer program that I worked on with Ron Hardin, which designs experiments. It's a very difficult mathematical question. What's the best way? If you have a process, an engineering process or an agricultural process that you're trying to optimize, you want to get the most yield of rice out of a plot of land, and you don't know how much of the different kinds of fertilizer to use and how much water. One of the nice applications we did was to designing printed circuits, to actually physically manufacturing printed circuits. And they had recently gotten a new machine, a new $10 million etching machine, which replaced the old one. It was much more sophisticated. There were a lot of settings. There were 6 or 8 variables you could control. And normally, you think that you adjust the cooking temperature, for example, and measure the output and see which cooking temperature gives you the biggest output. But in fact, all the variables are related. It's a complicated mathematical relationship which no one understands. So what you do is you make a series of tests. You set the cooking temperature at X, and you choose one of the 2 solvents that you could use, and you change the baking time to something. It's a 6-dimensional space in this case. And you're searching around in this 6-dimensional space to try to find the sweet spot, which gives you the best etchings. You're taking a piece of glass and cutting channels in it. And in order to see how good the channels are, you have to look at it under an electron microscope, and it takes a while.
That sounds like just trial and error, though. That sounds like
trial and error.
Almost I could do that.
Absolutely, you can. Yeah. Yes, but you're in a 6-dimensional space, and you don't know. So what they did was they used the parameters that worked for the old machine, but the results weren't very good.
Right.
And they were desperate. They would change this. It didn't have much of an effect. They would change that. So in the end, they came over to the statistics department and talked to the experts. This is a subject called design of experiments. And Ron Hardin and I had a program that we called Gossett that would solve this problem. You would tell it what the ranges of the variables were, how many experiments you wanted to make, how many test runs, and you wanted to keep that small, and what kind of effect you expected. And our program would say, all right, if you want to make 15 measurements, and the space is defined by the temperature can be between this and that, and so on, we would give you a set of 15 points to make the measurements. And the idea is you make those measurements, and then you figure out from that what the most likely, the best point is. So that was one of the things I did. And this was a program, it's still in use, because Ron Hardin still is absolutely brilliant programmer, one of the best ever.
OEIS sequence A000110. Bell or exponential numbers. Number of ways to partition a set of n labelled elements. 1, 1, 2, 5, 15, 52, 203, 877, 4,000.
Let's talk about the Online Encyclopedia.
Which wasn't online in those days, of course.
No.
Yeah. So one of the things, this was always a sideline for me.
Yeah.
One of the things in my thesis was to try to understand various properties of these neural networks.
Your thesis at Cornell?
The thesis at Cornell, which is this
there we go.
book here.
I got it in my hand.
Which was next to the Perceptron book.
It's called Lengths of Cycle Times in Random Neural Networks. Neil James Alexander Sloane, 1967.
Yes.
In gold embossed writing on the black cover there.
Yes.
Right.
It's online. You can find it. It's on the archive.
Okay.
ARCHIVE.
Yeah, we'll link to it.
Not the ARXIV preprint server.
Right.
But the Internet Archive, the people who run the Wayback Machine, where you can recover lost web pages.
Okay.
They also have a vast library of manuscripts and music and books.
We will include a link to Neil's thesis.
So one of the problems that came up, in fact, the first problem I started to look at was if you design a random neural network and you excite some of the neurons, make them fire, and watch what happens. Does the activity die out, or does it keep going? Do the calculations that are going on in this network, do they continue?
Like a game of life type thing?
Exactly, yes.
Right.
So I started looking at some very simple questions of this nature, and I started looking at trees, graphs, networks that didn't have any loops in them. So a very simple question was, if you pick a tree at random, the kind of graph that's called a tree.
Yeah.
And
not a tree with leaves and
wood
wood in the dirt.
Not a tree with leaves, no. Just a network with points and lines and no loops. And if you pick a point, and these trees are rooted, they have a base.
Yeah.
They're rooted in the ground. So if you start it, pick a node at random.
Yeah.
A very simple question. Pick a tree with 6 nodes. And we know how many there are. There are 6 to the 4th or 6 to the 5th, depending on how you count them. Yeah. It's n to the n-1 or n to the n-2 if there are n nodes. Pick one of these at random. Pick a node at random in the tree. Make that node fire downwards towards the root. Yeah. How long will it take to reach the root, at which point the activity dies? Right. Very simple question. It turned out to be very complicated. It's even hard to work out what the numbers are. Right. But I could work them out, and if you did it and normalized it, you could divide by n. You got a sequence, 1, 8. I still remember this was the first sequence, in a sense. Yeah. 1, 8, 78, 944, 13,800. Except I didn't have the 13,800 to begin with. Okay. I tried to just figure it out from the first few terms. Okay. It wasn't enough. So with a lot of effort, a lot of computing time, and the Burroughs machine over in the computer center at Cornell, I worked out one more term.
Okay, so you've got these numbers.
And I would like to know, is there a formula? Is there a recurrence? And the main thing is, how fast does it grow? And you could see that it was growing, but whether it was growing upwards like this or growing upwards like that, it wasn't clear. I didn't have enough terms to be able to figure out what the average value was doing.
OEIS sequence A000435. Normalized total height of all nodes in all rooted trees with n labeled nodes. 0, 1, 8, 78, 944, 13,800, 237,432, 4,708,100.
So I thought it would be very nice if I could find the sequence in some book. So I looked through the obvious books. And at that time, there were not very many books about combinatorics and discrete mathematics.
So you were hoping like someone else had already encountered this sequence of numbers, and you could learn more.
Because, for instance, a book by John Reardon called Introduction to Combinatorial Analysis, that was really the main book in combinatorics in those days, in the 1950s. That was the book.
Right.
And it had a lot of sequences in it.
Right.
And I went through and it was not there as far as I could see.
Yeah.
But I could see a lot of similar sequences. So I started writing them down. I thought, I'm going to have a lot of these problems to solve, so let's be prepared. So I started making a little table. And they were on file cards, little 3x5 cards. And I put them into a certain obvious order and collected them. And then I looked also in a couple of other canonical books. Abramowitz and Stegens, the National Bureau of Standards Handbook of Mathematics, had a lot of sequences in it. And there was Fletcher, Miller, Rosenhead and Comrie's Index to Mathematical Tables. Right. And there were a couple of other books. So I went through these books and collected those sequences. And then I put them on punched cards. So there was a little deck of punch cards that I carried around. And it grew, and I told various people about it, and then some people said, here's a sequence you probably don't have, but you should put it in. And other people said, oh, that's a really great idea. Richard Guy, for example, who is still a contributor, even though he's now 101 or 102, he still sends in sequences.
So, Neil, at this point, when you're starting to collect these sequences, starting your own private collection, were you only targeting sequences that you thought might be useful for your neural network research? Like, that one could be handy for my trees and my research and that? Or did you just straight away go, I want everything?
It was in between. It was not clear which sequences would be needed. It was not clear whether one needed sequences from number theory, like Euler's totient function, how many numbers less than or equal to n are relatively prime to n, that kind of thing. Very basic number theoretic sequences, the number of divisors of a number. These might well have been relevant and important. And obviously, if one's collecting sequences, you have to have powers of 2, because, if you've got a process that doubles the prime numbers.
Yeah.
So it was hard to say this sequence will never be useful. So I was inclusive.
OEIS sequence A000010. Euler totient function 1, 1, 2, 2, 4, 2, 6, 4, 6, 4, 10.
In these early days, were you thinking, I'm going to keep these until I finish my PhD? Were you thinking of the future, or were you just thinking this is going to be a tool that's going to help me become Dr. Sloane?
It wasn't quite as clear-cut as that, but it was obviously a useful thing to have. Many people said, boy, that's a great idea. I wonder why nobody has ever done this before. Nobody had done it before, and no one has done it since.
So this was obviously well before the days of sort of the internet and mass communication. How was word getting out in the 1960s that this guy called Neil Sloane at Cornell was even doing this?
Well, in a way, the world of combinatorics was a lot smaller in those days. There were a lot of people working in graph theory, and I wrote to a few of them, and they sent me sequences.
What would they just send you, like a piece of paper with 30 numbers and tell you this is the Fred Jones sequence and this is how it's generated? And you'd think,
there were a certain number of things like that, and I still have them in those binders that you saw downstairs.
Yeah.
There are 50 fat blue binders of correspondence and things, and preprints. People would send me, preprints of papers before they were published, or off-prints after they were published, or just postcards saying, here's a sequence, or airmail letters from all over the world.
So what was this starting to look like? You mentioned punch cards. Were there like folders and books? How were this disparate family of numbers you were being sent starting to be turned into something that was going to become a formal collection?
Well, the punch cards, you could run them through a sorter, although I didn't actually do that. It's much easier to sort them by hand,
right?
Because the position in the sort is not so well defined. So they just grew, more and more, and every paper or letter would contribute a sequence or two, and I would make a punched card or two for them. Usually there'd be a card for the numbers and a card for the description, and maybe a third card for the references.
Did this collection serve its original purpose? Did it end up being particularly useful for your research and your PhD?
Yes and no. The sequence I was really interested in, the first of the many, I never did I never did guess a formula. But I wrote to John Reardon, who was at Bell Labs, and I said, have you ever seen this? And he wrote back and said, a wonderful thing. He said, the way to solve this kind of question is to use Polya's theory of enumeration, Polya's counting theory. Here's actually what you do. And we wrote a joint paper.
Okay.
I forget when it came out, late 70s.
So the word is out that Neil Sloane's this guy collecting...
Oh, yes. So publishers would also come around to the universities talking to the faculty and saying, do you have a book we could publish? Do you have a manuscript you want published? So someone from academic press came around and said, was pointed to me.
Just that they're just looking for business. They're just looking for a book that might sell.
Yes. Yeah. And so academic press published Ed Beschler. Yes. Said, oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah. Can you get a couple of letters saying that it's interesting? Of course, that was no problem.
And that was published not as a book of curios, but as like a research resource, or
as a reference work.
Yeah,
it was called A Handbook of Integer Sequences.
Before it was published, and it was just a collection, presumably in your office.
A computer printout.
A computer printout. Was it being utilised by the researchers? Like, were people contacting you and saying?
Yes, yeah, sure. It was circulated. I sent it to D.H. Lehmer at University of California in Berkeley, and he sent some sequences. Frank Harari, big author of the big book on graph theory.
So besides
Claude Berge in Paris, who had a wonderful book on combinatorics, Analyse combinatoire, 2 little pocket books, 2 volumes. Wonderful books. I still have them over there.
So in addition to having a reputation as the guy you should send your sequences to, you had also been the guy to contact if you needed sequence help.
No. There were a few of them. But mostly it was people who had the sequences already, calling, sending them in to get them into the database. So up to 1973, I was still collecting. Okay. And then that book came out.
Yeah. Was it successful?
Very successful.
Yeah.
Martin Gardner wrote a very nice review in Scientific American.
Yeah.
And then, of course, once the book came out, people really started sending in more things.
Right.
And that rapidly got out of hand. Right. And also, I had just started work at Bell Labs.
Right.
And so this, in a way, was not a big thing.
What percentage of your time was this
I have no idea. It was just a hobby, something I did occasionally in the evenings.
Okay.
And after a while, when the computer science evolved, I could do it from home.
Right.
Because of there were teletype machines that you could work from home. That made a big difference. I didn't have to go up to the 6th floor at Bell Labs and get sandwiches. In the evening, I could work from home.
So it's growing and growing through the 70s. More and more's coming in. Help me understand how it evolves and get me close to the internet. Like, what are the next steps of the
There were quite a few more steps.
Go.
Because there were a lot of letters. I calculated there was about a cubic meter of letters that had accumulated over the years.
Right.
And I made some supplements to the first book, and they sent them out, circulated them to a few people, maybe 50 or 100 people saw the supplements. But I didn't have the time to make a new book until in the early 1990s, Simon Plouffe, who was at UQAM, the University of Quebec à Montréal, in Montreal, Canada, he did his thesis on looking for formulas for sequences in the database. And he had 300 or 400 further sequences that he had. And so he offered to help do a new version.
Okay.
So that book was, again, academic press, came out in 1995, called The Encyclopedia of Integer Sequences. And a year later, of course, that came out, that had about 5,000 sequences in it,
Yeah.
the book. So
Just page after page of number sequences.
Yeah,
with
well,
a
it was a
description
long
of-
introduction
Okay.
describing what you do when you come across a strange sequence.
Yeah.
There was a discussion of various classes of sequences,
Yeah.
sequences from graph theory, sequences from geometry, from algebra, from all the parts of mathematics. There were and there were lots of illustrations illustrating, for instance, the number of ways to have a necklace with n beads, each of which could be red or blue.
Right.
You could have red, red, blue, blue, or you could have red, blue, red, blue. And if you turned it over, that didn't make a difference. So how many necklaces are there? Again, that's Polya's counting theory. Tells you the answer to that.
So with the first book in the 70s and then the second book in the early 90s, who's buying this book and what are they using it for?
People who love numbers, your Scientific American type, people who listen to Numberphile, for example.
Right.
The people who like numbers.
Right.
Everybody likes playing around with numbers.
Right.
Guessing the next term of a sequence.
But it's not a mathematical resource. It's not like an academic...
Yes, it is. The academics used it too.
Right.
If you're working on a problem in graph theory and you come across a sequence that goes 1, 2, 17, 93, who are you going to call?
So
you
that's-
look it up in the OAIS.
Right.
Well, in those days, it was the EIS.
Yeah.
And before that, it was the HIS, the Handbook of Integer Sequences. The second book was the Encyclopedia, the EIS. And then a year later, Simon Plouffe and I put it on the internet.
Right.
Because we waited. There were 5,000, roughly, in the 1995 book. We waited until it had doubled in size. And we put it on the internet.
Okay.
No one could object to that. It was a totally different ballgame by then.
Okay.
And it's been growing ever since. It grows at about 15,000 a year still. It's been pretty flat. We're up to 320,000 sequences now.
I sometimes go in there like for fun because it's fun to look at. But this is like a genuine resource, isn't it? People are encountering number sequences and thinking, have I found something new or what am I looking at? And they'll just enter the numbers into your database and it'll
Yes.
pop out and they'll say, oh, someone has already found this and already knows what this is. And
When they look up a sequence and they find it's there, usually they're very happy because they don't have to think about it. The thinking's been done, and very often they'll find the formula they were looking for, and that's basically what they want. Or, of course, they'll find that it's there, and there'll be a comment that says, this is a really hard sequence. And that's very interesting information if you're working on a problem. You want to know, is this a really hard problem like the Riemann hypothesis or the 3x plus 1 problem, in which case I shouldn't waste time trying to solve it? Or if maybe it's a very simple sequence in the end, like the Catalan numbers or something else that is well studied. So that's always good information one way or the other. If it is there and it's one you were very proud of discovering yourself, then you're unhappy to find that you've been anticipated. But it also happens that your interpretation is different from the one in the database, in which case you should send it in and say, look, this is also the number of ways to design something or other with 6 legs. If you look up a sequence and it's not there, well, that's good news and bad news. It means good news. It's good in the sense that probably you're doing something new. Of course, that's not necessarily true. Many people in the world don't know about the OEIS and have neglected, or even if they know about it, they've neglected to send in the sequence, or they've been meaning to send it in and they haven't gotten around to it yet.
so
That's very bad.
tell me about how it's run now. It's no longer just you and your
It's no longer
binders.
just me.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there came a time around 2009 when things at Bell Labs, it was AT&T Bell Labs, things were changing. And it was clear the research atmosphere was changing for the worse. Management was becoming more concerned with applications and making money and so on. The labs weren't the place that they used to be. And so it became clear that I should find another home. Ever since I joined the labs in 1968-69, AT&T Bell Labs have been very generous about letting me work on it and host it on my webpage on the AT&T website.
So everyone at your work knew this was like your side thing, like
It was a side thing, sure.
Yeah.
And occasionally it would get written up. They were very happy. It was written up in Slashdot. You know that online magazine? It got written up there, and it got so many hits, it crashed the whole of AT&T Research's website.
Right.
And the math department was very happy
Right.
when that happened.
Yeah, right.
But, things changed,
Yeah.
and it became clear that I needed to find a host, a place for it to live independent of the labs.
Yeah.
So with the help of some very good people, we set up a foundation called the OAIS Foundation Incorporated in New Jersey, and we transferred the intellectual property to it.
Right.
Without making it too clear who owned it beforehand, because that was never something that I really ever thought about.
Right.
But from that point on, from 2009 on, it was owned, the intellectual property was owned by the foundation, and the foundation's charter was to raise money to support the database forever.
Right.
And so from then on, we've got a board of trustees. I'm still the president. There are 12 or 13 other trustees who help run it. And a year or so later, we converted it into a wiki.
Right.
So the wiki format is you can send in a sequence, but it gets reviewed by a board of volunteer editors.
How large is this group and how qualified are they to do this?
Some of them are very qualified indeed.
Yeah.
And others are really experts who may be not professional mathematicians, but they know a lot about sequences and others, not just, mathematical sequences, but all kinds of sequences and computers and so on.
Yeah.
So there's a very disciplined group of people who do most of the work now. Wonderful people.
How much of your time does it take up and how important are those volunteers? I mean, did you say, 15,000 a year being added or something?
Yes. Yeah, about 50 a day. New ones. Plus maybe 50 comments on existing sequences.
Right.
So I used to do everything myself up until 2010, 2011.
Yeah.
And then the other editors were able to access the database and approve or make changes, suggest changes, communicate, discuss things with the submitters, with the contributors.
Neil, are you still hands-on? Are you still getting your hands dirty with the numbers? Or
Yes,
are you more,
sure.
You're not some overlord just sitting looking after the finances now. Like you're still in there.
Both. I'm still down there
Right.
in the pit. Yeah,
Okay.
wrestling with the contributors, editing the sequences, saying, what exactly do you mean by that?
Do you get mischievous contributions then, or contributions that are illegitimate? Like, is there do you have to reject a lot of stuff that people send in and think they found some incredible sequence and you're like, this doesn't belong on this encyclopedia, or it's wrong, or...
Quite often, a new contributor will send in 1 or 2 or 3 sequences that don't belong.
Yeah.
But, normally that only happens once
Okay.
with each person. Most of the trouble is people sending in duplicates, sequences that are there already, and they didn't look carefully, or they had a mistake in their work.
Right.
And once the mistake was corrected, it turned out to be a duplicate.
How is the encyclopedia used now? Like, how is it useful to the world? Who's using it? How are they using it?
Roughly speaking, everybody. They're professional, mathematicians, chemists, physicists use it because they're working on a problem and they come up with a sequence of numbers and they really want to know quickly, what's the formula for this? Is it new? Is it hard? Is it easy? Is this a famous hard problem that I've discovered? So it saves people. So it's like a dictionary.
Is it like a situation where I could be a chemist and I'm doing some kind of work,
Exactly.
and a sequence of numbers gets spat out, I put it into the OEIS, and I find out this number sequence has been used in a whole other discipline or a whole other part of field of endeavour, and sort of linkages can be made?
Yes, absolutely. That happens all the time. Yeah, there are many. In fact, I keep a list of all the papers that have cited articles and websites, books that have cited the OAIS. Very often they'll say things like, I couldn't have done this without the OAIS. Or we discovered this connection, this unexpected connection, thanks to the OEIS. Yes, exactly.
When you look at it now, you look at the site, the resource, but also the interface and all those things about it. What are you most pleased about, and what are you least pleased about? Like, if you could start again and change something or do something better, tell me what you're happy with, but also tell me what you're not happy with.
That's a complicated question. 2 questions. There's the question of money. Because we don't have enough editors. And the question is, should we have a managing editor who is paid and runs things?
Right.
Well, that would be much more complicated, because then we'd have to raise money every year to pay this person.
Are you kind of not fulfilling that role anyway, voluntarily?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But that presumably won't go on forever.
Yeah.
And so there may come a time when, maybe we have to find a consortium to run it or something. It's not clear. So I'm happy and unhappy with the fact that it's a volunteer organization and we keep a low financial profile.
What do you think? Maybe you should have been more professional from the start? Or do you ever think about things like advertising and things like, how do you deal with...
No, it doesn't appeal at all. I've always discouraged. I think it's even in the bylaws of the foundation that we won't accept advertising, that it will always be free.
Yeah.
I'm very happy with the editing. We have some really wonderful people who are just brilliant. And there's also the mailing list. There's a Sequence Fans mailing list, which is very good. It's like a supercomputer for solving problems.
Is it still a project that brings you pleasure, or is it like a great, albatross?
Oh, no, it's always pleasure.
Right.
Yes, it's always been pleasure. Yes, yes. Many lovely sequences. That sequence from, for example, Eric Angelini in Brussels. He alone has made my life very happy. He has wonderful ideas of sequences.
So do you have your sort of your teacher's pet favourite sequence makers, do you? And whenever he or she contributes a new one, you're like, oh, what have you cooked up this time?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Eric Angelini, Remy Segrist. Those are my 2 most favourite people, I think, at the moment. But, it varies. People will contribute for a year or 2 and then drop out.
Sometimes it feels like some of these sequences are just sequences for the sake of sequences. Like someone will say, here's the prime numbers, but all the prime numbers plus 1.
Yeah.
Or just coming up with all these, just pulling algorithms from the air. Just because you can, because no one's done it before.
That's right. Yes, we discourage that, of course. You shouldn't just make up a sequence because it's not in the OEIS. Originally, the criterion was it should be published somewhere.
Okay.
And that's still my fallback reason for rejecting 2 artificial sequences. I have an abbreviation for when a sequence is rejected. It's NOGI, not of general interest.
Okay, but sometimes you do seem to have some in there that are playful or...
Certainly playful, or variations on existing sequences, legitimate variations.
But you told me about another one that was like sort of coronation years of the different King Louis and things like that, which obviously there's not going to be a chemist who's going to plug in those numbers into the OEIS. And it's
don't know, a French chemist whose son is studying for a test.
Right.
I mean, this is something you need to know.
Okay.
And that particular one, the coronation dates of the King Louis of France, that actually appeared on a test somewhere.
Okay.
And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. It's got plenty of terms.
OEIS sequence A008746. Dates of birth of Kings Louis I, II, etc. of France. 778, 846, 863, 921, 967, 1081, 1121,
You obviously know a lot about the people who are contributing and editing it. Do you know much about the people who are using it at the other end? Or are they just a stat, a number of hits and that?
Yeah, I don't even know what the number of hits is. I know it's very large.
Yeah.
I mean, very, very large. We've noticed there was somebody who, for several months, was looking up a sequence several times a second, every second of every minute of every day for 3 months. So until we put in some safeguards to throttle back this kind of thing.
What's happening there? Is that just people downloading it or stealing it?
Basically, making their own copy of it. Yes.
That's not an allowed thing, or?
It's
discouraged.
We discourage it, yeah. We certainly don't want people setting up any copy of the site.
Yeah.
Because once that happens, things get terribly confused.
Yeah.
You never know which version. The database changes all the time. Every minute, sequences are being changed.
It seems like something that could very easily become littered with mistakes, like Wikipedia,
Yes.
Just completely wrong sequences must be in there.
There are, but we are steadily weeding them out.
Yeah.
Several of the editors have written programs that look for near matches between sequences.
Right.
So Richard Matter, for example, every month maybe runs a program that looks for near matches. And another German contributor, Georg Fischer, has been doing the same thing. So they turn up duplicates or near duplicates, which turn out very often to be duplicates. So we declare, if it's a recent sequence, we just reject the recent incorrect one or merge them and end up with one correct one and one that's been declared dead or it's been rejected and the A number has been recycled. So there's a lot of that going on. And so we're steadily improving the accuracy.
Neil, there are articles out there on the internet and videos and things where you're asked for your 5 of your favorites or 10 of your favorite sequences. I'll link to some of them so people can go and read things you've said in the past. And you've also been filming Numberphile videos with me, which some have already been on Numberphile, some are still to come. So I will encourage people to keep an eye out for those. But I can't do a podcast with you and not at least ask you for one of your go-to sequences that also helps people understand what the OAIS is all about. Can you give me a sequence that, brings you some pleasure that is perhaps easy to describe in an audio format?
Well, I think I can give you a couple. There's the EKG sequence, and there's Rackaman's sequence, Bernardo Rackaman Sanchez. That's A5132 in the database, and that's the subject, I believe, of one of your Numberphile videos.
Alex Bellos spoke about it.
Alex Bellos.
After he spoke to you.
Yes,
when I interviewed him, he said this is one of Neil Sloane's favourites.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Yes. So that one, A5132, Rackaman's sequence.
OEIS sequence A005132. Recommand sequence 0, 1, 3, 6, 2, 7, 13, 20, 12, 21.
Another favorite is Dion Heisweit's sequence. Maybe that's a video that we should do sometime.
Okay.
But it's a very nice sequence. It grows unbelievably slowly, but it never stops. It keeps growing forever. So it begins 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2.
Okay.
It's Dion Heisweit's sequence. After 220 terms, you get to a 4. Okay. And the question for quite a while, for a week or two, was, do you ever get a 5? And the answer turned out, yes, you do get a 5, but you don't get a 5 until you go out to 10 to the power 23 terms,
right?
Which is a very large number.
Of course, one of the joys of the OEIS as well is you've built in a functionality where people can then listen to a sequence, coded onto musical notes. So here on the podcast, at least, maybe I can play people some audio of some of these sequences as well.
Play A5132, played on the special effects setting of the instrument, the MIDI file, special effects FX2. Or Goblins, the Goblin setting. That's one of my favorites.
That's it for today on the podcast. Our thanks to Neil. We've got lots of links in the show notes for you to look at. The most important one is to the OEIS itself. You can go to oeis.org and check out the encyclopedia. Hours of fun to be had. While you're there, you can also make a donation to the project if you're so inclined. I'm sure Neil would really appreciate it. The Numberphile podcast is made possible by MSRI, the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute in Berkeley, California. And also in Berkeley, we're supported by Maya Sound, the audio engineering company that sponsored this episode. Our thanks to them as always. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Brady Haran, so how about we end this episode with my favourite sequence?
OEIS sequence A247698. Brady numbers 2308, 4261, 6,569, 10,830, 17,399, 28,229, 45,628, 73,857, 119,480.